I'm talking today to Pastor Wm Fitch, who pastored in the city of Windsor for many years and is passing through Hamilton, so we've asked him to come and join us today in the pastor's study. Pastor Fitch, good to have you here. It's been a while since we've seen each other.
Been a real pleasure for me to catch up with you once again after spending a few years together in the Windsor area.
Yes.
And now to come back here, and while we're at Ancaster, we have a chance to get acquainted again.
Right. Now, we're going to talk today about Bible prophecies, a theme I know that you enjoy and talk a great deal about in the pulpit. I'm thinking particularly of Matthew 24, where the disciples asked Jesus about the signs of the end time. They talked about the destruction of the temple, and then they asked also about the end of the world. And maybe you could just share a little bit with us about this whole theme.
Well, history gives us a very, very accurate record of the fact that the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D., and the words of Jesus here were actually fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
But with the destruction of the temple also came the actual destruction of the Jewish people in the nation. They were scattered all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible says he came unto his own, and his own received him not. But to as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. But the Jews turned their back on him, and with the result that they were scattered throughout the world.
And you're talking about the Lord Jesus there.
Yes, Jesus
Mm-hmm.
said this to them
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And a great deal of this 24th chapter is talking about what would happen to the Jews during this time when they would be scattered around the world and before they would be brought back as a nation.
Yes. Didn't Jesus say something about the city of Jerusalem being trodden down by Gentile powers?
In Luke chapter 21:24, it said, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
You see, we have to realize that God has a plan. This isn't just a helter-skelter deal. God has a plan for the Jews, he has a plan for the church, and he has a plan for the present world.
Mm-hmm.
And it all dovetails in together. We are living in what is the most momentous days that we could live,
Mm-hmm.
the most important era of all of the dispensations. Fact of the matter is, the other dispensations have all gone by, and we're living in the dispensation of grace. And during the dispensation of grace, the Lord is preparing a church to be with him and
Yes.
to be his bride. That church is
Now,
the body, the bride, and he's the head of it.
I understand that Jerusalem came under Gentile powers about 500 or so BC, back in the Old Testament times, and Jesus said it would remain there until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, is Jerusalem still under Gentile control?
It was until 1967.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, God began to work out his plan. You see, there's three important things that are happening in the world that the average person doesn't pay any attention to it. We're more concerned about missiles and Russia and United States and star warfare and what have you. But the Bible, the main theme of the Bible and prophecy is that God has a plan for his people, the
Mm-hmm.
Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and he has a plan for the church, and he's working this all out.
Now, what happened in 1967?
In 1967, you see, first of all, in 1917 or 18, through the Balfour Treaty, after England had taken Palestine from the Turks, all those years, from the days of Nebuchadnezzar, 590, 600 BC, they were always under Gentile domination.
Mm-hmm.
And right up until that time, even when the Turks were in charge of the country, then England drove the Turks out and gave it back to the Jews. And the Jews went back in 17. In just 30 years, they had driven the Arabs out, and they had taken possession of the land to the place of where they already had their own flag. They started their own government. They had their Knesset. And they set up their own system of government and was recognized throughout the world.
Now that is an amazing fulfillment of prophecy. We're talking over 2,000 years here, from 590 BC to 1918 or so.
1918.
And people wonder, you know, if Bible prophecy is fulfilled today, or how do we know the Bible's true? That's got to be one of the most amazing ones.
That's the beginning of it, right there. Where God's plan is being worked out.
And now, is that an indication that we are in the end time? That's happened in our generation. 1948, Israel became a nation, had their own flag.
15th.
Why, even I was alive then, Brother Fitch. But that is a phenomenal fulfillment of prophecy.
The Arabs were not happy about this, and they were still going to drive them out. If you read Psalm 83, it talks about all of the different Arab races getting together to drive the Jews out, and so they would not be a nation. And Nasser, who happened to be the leader of Egypt at that time, in order to get the esteem of the Arab world, he figured that he would take the initiative. Russia armed them to the teeth. They had up-to-date equipment, airplanes, tanks, and everything. And Israel had only obsolete equipment. But with the radar facing toward Jerusalem, they thought they were safe. And right at that time, the Jews were realizing that they didn't have much time. They had to act quick. So they sent their airplanes out around the Mediterranean, in behind the radar equipment, and dropped their napalm bombs on the Egyptian Air Force, and just literally welded the wings together. And they never got off the ground. Well, then they swung their armies around and head toward Jerusalem. And at that time, that was what we call the Six-Day War in June 5, 6, 7. It was really only a 3-day war. But the Jews moved into Jerusalem, and they took over Jerusalem. The Jordanians were in charge at that time under British generals, and they had a strong force in Jerusalem. But the Jews drove them right out. They just went out very fast. And the result was that Luke 21:24 was actually starting to be fulfilled at that time. From that day till now, Jerusalem has been under the domination of the Jews. They have never let that go, and as they stood by the Wailing Wall, they have said, never again will they let the country be under domination of anyone else. They'll save it with their lives.
Now, we often hear it said that the Jews, or Israel, God's people, whatever term you may use here, is something like a clock. You hear it referred to as God's time clock, to keep your eye on Israel, to know where we're at in the God's whole eternal plan. Do you go along with that?
Well, that same chapter in Luke tells us that when these things begin to come to pass, then look up, for our redemption draweth nigh. And he said, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. So with the Jews moving back into Jerusalem, and with the general world conditions as they are, everything's heading up to the place of where God's going to keep his word. You see, he has to have the Jew back in Jerusalem because he promised Mary when Jesus was born. In Luke chapter 1, it tells us of the genealogy. It talks about Joseph being of David, and the angel told Mary she was going to have a child, but she said, the angel said to Mary, he'll be called the Son of the Highest, and he'll be great. And then he will sit upon the throne of his father David. Now, the Jews have to be back there for him to sit upon the throne of his father David. And not only was Joseph of the lineage of David, but Mary was. Joseph came down Solomon's line, and Mary came down Nathan's line, with the result that Jesus Christ is the only living actual heir to the throne of David. And the fact is that the angel promised Mary, your son, your child, that's our Jesus, is going to sit on the throne of his father David, and you'll reign in the city of Jerusalem forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
So the plan is that God is taking his people back there. It's prophesied in Isaiah, prophesied in Ezekiel, that he'd bring them from the east, the west, the north, and the south, and bring them back to the land of Israel and have them there. And that's where they're going to be.
So now, in order for that to happen, Christ has got to return. And a little later on, we'd like to talk about that, about the actual second coming of Christ to this earth. I was going to ask you, though, first of all, do you have any idea how many Jews have returned back to Israel? I don't personally know the figure.
About 5 million, 500 million.
500 million?
5 million.
5 million. Does it have that from around the world that have made their way back to their homeland? And that's a major move. Go back there and establish a home and take their families and start afresh again. And even that, again, is a fulfillment of prophecy.
You see, they tried to keep them from getting back there. The Assyrians, within a matter of 6, 7 years, the Assyrians struck on Yom Kippur, and they tried to drive them out. Each time they've been supported by Russia. And then again in 1982. See, 1973 was the Yom Kippur War. Well, then the PLO took over Lebanon, and they were getting all ready to strike at Israel. The fact of the matter is they had $2 billion worth of equipment in the tunnels under Sidon and Beirut, ready to make a strike at Israel. And they were going to use the PLO as a spearhead to make the start and take over Lebanon, and then they were going to take over Israel. They were going to get the oil-rich fields of all that Far East area under their domination, and then they were going to strike at Canada. Yeah. They even had it on the walls, all their maps on the walls of the caverns. It shows their whole program and their whole plan. Wow. And their idea was to take over all of that and then to strike at America.
Yeah.
And
Pastor Fitch, before our song, we were talking about the fact of the Russian stockpile of weapons that was discovered, I believe it was in 1982.
Right, August the 4th.
We didn't hear a whole lot about that in the media, at least not that I'm aware of.
The reporters didn't put it through. I have information that they were all advised and able to take pictures of the maps and the detail of all of those canyons under the city area of both Beirut and Sidon. But when it came to the media, they did not publish it. They didn't put it out.
No. You know, it amazes me that the sovereignty of God has protected that little nation of Israel. And right. We've talked on this program a great deal about that little nation being God's time clock. Now, there are other signs, aren't there, about the coming of the Lord. When when the disciples rather asked Jesus about the signs of the end time, what you've been telling us is we can look towards Israel as a sign. Now, what are some other things we should look for today?
He also said that this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. There never has been a time when the gospel has gone out like it is today. When we hear of great evangelists like Billy Graham and Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart said Sunday morning he has a listening audience of 10,000 people. There are many others, just like our present 100 Huntley in Toronto, and they have a show at the X in Vancouver where they've got a show called The Pavilion. And we're receiving reports of literally hundreds going through there, and some of them even giving their hearts to the Lord. Now we have many others like Schuler and Pat Robinson and
PTL.
The PTL Club, Baker, and all the rest of them. So that actually, as far as we know, the last statistics I read was we have somewhere around 160 million evangelical people around the world. Now, that is a tremendous amount of people, but in comparison to 5 billion the population of the world is small.
Yes.
But the fact is that the gospel is going out now, and it's literally going into, I don't know how many nations. I think the Gideon Bible Society has translated the Bible into somewhere over 1,200 to 1,500 different languages and dialects, and it's going out with radio, with missionaries. They're sending them out on bicycles in every conceivable way.
Now,
the message is going out today like it never did before.
So in keeping with that, if the gospel has to go out into all nations, it seems that this modern technology, television, satellites, etc., are being used of God to get the gospel out. Now, I'm sure that man would boast of those inventions, that that is the brain of man, and it must be that God has, at this end time, somehow been involved here, because while those tools are being used of Satan and for evil, at the same time, they're also greatly speeding up the spread of the gospel, aren't they?
When you think of the millions, maybe, well, that's hardly enough to express it, but there are literally millions of people in apartments way up on the 14th floor. All they're doing is turning on a knob, and they're listening to Jimmy Swaggart. They're listening to the gospel. So that the radio and TV mechanic has really been a means of spreading the gospel throughout the world. So that we can hardly estimate how tremendous there's a great flow of the gospel out all over the world. But the main purpose is that the Lord is preparing a bride for his son. And in Ephesians chapter 5, he says it'll be a bride that will be pure and spotless, without wrinkle, living in holiness, serving God, and being ready for the rapture. See, many people don't realize that there's going to be a rapture when this bride is going to be taken out of the world and taken up before the tribulation and before the Armageddon. That a lot of people, they know the word Armageddon, but they don't know where it fits in. Between the millennium and the day of grace that we're living is the tribulation. But before the tribulation, the church is caught up in the air to meet the Lord. The Lord comes and meets them halfway and takes them back up to the, first of all, to the rewards, and then to the marriage supper of the Lamb. It tells us in Revelation chapter 19, rejoice, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. And it's actually, the bride is the church. And the church is the body. And we're going to be united in marriage at the marriage supper of the Lamb in the air while the tribulation is going on this earth. Then we come back with him as his bride, mounted on white horses. He's King of kings and Lord of lords, not Queen of queens. He's King of kings and Lord of lords, and he's going to reign. And Revelation chapter 5 says that we will reign with him for 1,000 years on the earth. That's the millennium, you see.
Pastor Fitch, we've talked a great deal now about the signs of the coming of the Lord and the end of the world as outlined in Matthew 24. First of all, I think we've said that we should look to Israel as a sign. And now we've talked about the church, the gospel going out and people being saved, born again into the family of God. What about the world itself? What about world conditions? Are there signs there? Certainly some people think this world is getting better and better. It seems to me it's getting worse and worse. Are there any signs there that we should be looking for?
Well, he gave them a sign. I mean, he made mention of that which is a sign. And it says here in verse 38, as the days of Noah were, so shall it also be the coming of the day of the Son of Man. For in those days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. So the fact of the matter is that God said, Jesus was telling them right here on this particular day, that when the conditions in the world become like it was in Noah's day, and in Luke chapter 17 it says, as it was in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's day, they were eating, drinking, marrying, all the things that Well, we all know that sodomy and the big scare today is AIDS.
Yes.
And all the rest of these things that are happening.
So this whole homosexual scene is not new. In Sodom and Gomorrah, it was a major problem.
That's way back in Abraham's day.
Yeah. Did God bring judgment on that?
Fire and brimstone destroyed the whole area.
Yeah.
And they never have had anything to give any semblance of it since.
Yeah.
And the flood, you see a lot of, Noah preached for 100 years. And they said, oh, it never happened. There's nothing but more than they do on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
There'll never be any water to float that boat. You just got to be out of your mind.
Yeah.
But the actual fact is it happened. And first thing you know, the waters came up and the waters came down, and God made believers out of them in a hurry.
Yeah.
They climbed to the top of the mountains. They climbed to the top of the houses. They climbed to the top of the trees. They climbed as high as they could get, and the waters were coming up.
Yeah.
And all the time the waters were coming up, Noah and his family were in the boat safe.
Yes.
And they have to cry out. Noah was right.
Pastor
But it
Fitch,
was too late.
speaking of too late, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
This has been great today, talking about this theme of Bible prophecy. It's been great having you here. And I hope and pray that somebody we've talked to today will be challenged afresh to get into the Bible and discover that this book is true. God knows what he's talking about.